聞こえていますか私の声が青く透明な水の中
Down in the depths, water drifts amok with a tint of red, and we see a tale of regret and the potentials lost with simple choices. Sound of Drop, Fall into Poison tells a straightforward story with a background and lore shrouded in that red, bloody light. Sound of Drop is a visual novel originally released for PC outside of the typical Steam platform after being developed by Aiueo Kompany, if I'm pronouncing that right. A Steam release came later with expanded content, and that extended the story to answer mysteries left unsolved in the original routes. In late 2015, a localization company, Sekai Project, released an English version of the visual novel's Steam release. I can't honestly say Sound of Drop has a significant following. In fact, it was sort of difficult to find some of its history when I tried to research it for this, and this seemed particularly evident westward. However, many great games have never seen Western fame in the past, and some never found their niche within their genre even. Does Sound of Drop deserve a chance at that fame? Does it deserve a chance beyond its simple exposure to potential audiences? Time will tell. But just remember, don't die. Sound of Drop, Fall into Poison is a visual novel, and it definitely doesn't try to do much else. Some visual novels, they can attempt to mix it up by introducing minigames or other random mechanics to mix up the action throughout. Sound of Drop is much more traditional, as it doesn't really make an attempt to be more than the base visual novel concept. It wants to tell a story, and really that's fine by me. Typically, a visual novel is a matter of choices leading down different routes towards the endings and uses those different ways of storytelling to give answers to the mysteries all stories derive interest from. In most cases, the choices do one of three things. First, choices can determine what people think of you. Based on how you've gotten along with characters, you unlock different story deviations at the turning point of the story. Second, choices could also be about dodging bad events. Game overs are often the end result of getting those bad issues, those things you're trying to dodge. In either of these cases, different endings are also feasible from those different choices. Lastly, you have the combination of the two. Character endings with occasional bad endings are not an uncommon thing to see in visual novels. Sound of Drop is option number 2. Many choices you make will be inconsequential, and many others will be a matter of life or death. A few choices throughout will determine the story route that you follow to one of 4 true endings. Other than that, the gameplay is basically, non-existent. The visual novel is a visual novel. It's not romance-based. It really drives its appeal over tension versus comedy or intimacy. Essentially, it will be held up by its story, not its base interactions like you'd see in like a platformer. Imagine an aquarium. Now, imagine dying. There's your premise. Sound of Drop, Fall into Poison is a story of a killer aquarium in, you guessed it, Japan. Mayumi, our MC, is invited by her best friend Himeno to the aquarium to investigate rumors of the bloody phenomenon on the night of the full moon. Their intentions are innocent, as Himeno's curiosity about the strange and entertaining rumors gets the better of her. What she doesn't know is that Mayumi had experienced tragedy there before. Her precious little sister, named Mari, had gone missing at the aquarium, and she has since lived her life like an only child ever since. As they investigate the aquarium, nothing special happens. As they start to accept the normality of the situation, a voice and flash of a memory pass through Mayumi's head. Is that her sister? A delusional chase later, and Mayumi finds herself in that same aquarium. Or is it? Sound of Drop is a very traditional style visual novel that really drives itself off of avoiding bad endings and discovering one of 4 potential true endings. Storytelling-wise, the story is told through a typical visual novel style, only really tries to push its storytelling when the bad ends come into play. Most CGs are dedicated towards these bad ends, and a decent amount are gore-related. It's actually sort of surprising how much detail of the writing and story goes into the gruesome ends. If you like horror aspects invading your visual novel, then this will probably be a treat. I'm not the biggest fan of that style myself, so I can't say at the very least it's not so alienating that those like me will be pushed away. You can still enjoy it one way or another. Now, the characters range from appealing to feeling like cardboard cutouts. Mayumi herself has enough flexibility to work as a player character, but the story revolves around her character arc so much that it might be a problem. You can call her timid, you can call her cold, but overall, she really doesn't have much going on outside her basic goals of survival for herself and correcting her regrets. The theme of the goals determining the characterization might be just a notch too prominent too. It's not a large cast, but most of the characters are just a bit too perfect for their end goal at times. This hurts and helps the main focus of the plot, which are basically the character arcs. With the cast capping out at around 8 and a setting that is small and contained, the light at the end of the tunnel is not one of a large world building. Instead, the mystery of the deadly aquarium is quite personal, with everyone having a link that pulled them into the scenario themselves. Without getting too much into spoilers, the mystery is actually quite interesting and presented in a way that emphasizes the characters. Questions pertain more to why over, say, how, and the story provides well enough to satisfy in both regards. Connected to that, I will note the antagonist is really quite flat in this story. If you know the game's story, you probably understand why it has to be like that, but it just makes them a much less compelling character in the end, as they are just that antagonist for every single one of the endings. Speaking of endings, we have 4, well, outside of the bad endings, there's a lot of those. The original 2 come from the release before the Steam release, and do well to end the character arc and story in a quite satisfying way. The new content adds 2 more true endings and a new prologue. All of these are available after receiving one of the previous endings. With it comes a new, great character, and many answers to the natures of different questions that were left lingering, even if you don't feel like it really needed to be answered because it's just told in a way that wasn't that bad. I mean, it's all good new content, and I would recommend going through the endings in their assigned numerical order for the best divulging of information about the plot. Overall, I will also note that the plot is quite thematic. It tackles a pretty straightforward one too: regret. From character arcs, motivations, character flaws, and the whole nature of the deadly aquarium, it all ties back to that simple concept. It benefits from a tension-filled story with bad ends around every corner. The horror aspect of the storytelling does well to bring about compelling events as the mystery is served in pieces. And after you get past that, there isn't a ton more to it. If you're in the market for a good story to pass the time with, this is certainly no slouch. I will note, the presentation isn't bad. The UI is nice and has some intricacies and touches to it that make it a good eye pleaser. Functionally, it's pretty solid too, with most actions just a few quick button presses away, if not a single one. It is a visual novel UI, so you have the backgrounds, character portraits, and text boxes above all that, and it does a good job of just doing that well. And it might sound kind of weird for me to start out with that, but it really does tell a story of its own, so it's just so unmemorable. Don't get me wrong, it's all solid, but there's only one real area I feel as though it really tries in: the gore. I mentioned this in my story comments, but there is almost a fetishization of the horror aspects of the story that make them more prominent. It does well to shift the tone of the story to horror as necessary. In fact, tension building is a great strength here, but that's about where that step up ends. Much of the remaining presentation just doesn't feel like it's trying that much. It doesn't take away anything from the experience, and maybe it was intentional in order to shift the focus where they wanted to. Maybe the developers just wanted to let the story have its driving force and bulked up the horror aspects of the presentation to assist that storytelling mechanism. And hell, it could even be a good design choice, all things considered. But it doesn't leave me with much to talk about here. The character art is good, though it does sort of take that lazy route with the same portrait, same position, same pose, with slight variations to create different emotions for like the expressions. And the CGs have a nice lighting and color schemes to them, and that keeps the aesthetic consistent. And you also have the chibi game over art, which is a nice touch because those are pretty well done. Musically, I don't have to say much either. I like the title track screen, everything else. I recognized stuff when I was looking for music to use in this review, but I really can't say I ever felt a desire to listen to any of the music again. I guess this would be a good way to put it. I forgot that there was even this much music in the game. It's just that unmemorable. Again, the presentation is, I guess, solid, but just nothing stands out, bar a few things. I will admit I've sort of spent quite a bit of time speaking about how aspects of the experience just don't stand out. In a sense, it's an odd impression to take away from something you enjoyed. Oh wait, you might ask? After all this you're saying you enjoyed it? Oh, the horror. And yes, I did enjoy the horror elements too. But overall here, it's easy to see where the value comes from. The premise is quite interesting and paced well for its purposes. It's not long either, taking about 6 to 8 hours to get to one of the endings. Another few hours should be dedicated to additional endings unlocked after you beat the story once, and given the small scale and how personal the story is, this length is probably a boon. Dragging this on much longer would probably stretch the appeal to a breaking point, and can really start to be felt if you go all the way with the extra endings. The premise is not the only enjoyable part about it too. It does do visual novel style horror quite well. Admittedly, horror in excess has never been my cup of tea, and it did have its moments, going a notch or two too far for my preferences. Generally, the horror is used as a mechanism for pacing. It fills in the gaps and grabs interest as the mystery is served in slices. In this role, it's used quite effectively. Speaking of storytelling, I will now refer back to what I seem to love to talk about, moment-to-moment writing. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean the ability for any given moment of storytelling to pull the player in by sheer entertainment value over just what content is on display. Basically, does it have the pure writing quality to pull the player in whether it has a prize horse to show off or not? Short answer, it's okay. And sometimes mediocre, but usually okay. You have some enjoyable back and forth between characters that are some of my favorite moments in the entire story. At the same time, you tend to find a lot of characters sidelined or indisposed at times. Much of the stories spent with Mayumi are largely uninteresting character insert, pushing through horror scenarios. I mean, the horror holds up pretty well on its own, given my typical disinterest in pure horror storytelling, but at the same time, it's maybe a little too reliant on that. Lastly, I will note how effective the endings are. With 4 on the table, there is a good question to ask. Are they really worth the mystery? Generally, I say they're good. All the endings feel conclusive, and the mystery is built up in a way that will leave answers at a good place. The extra endings for the Steam release may stretch the concept a notch beyond the room it had, but those add some new layers, as they were effective in the originals as well, that are really probably a boon to the overall aspects. Overall, there are ups and downs, but it certainly felt worth my time. I didn't regret anything about doing it. I enjoyed myself all the way through, and that is a big thing to say about any sort of experience. Even if I can't pull out a lot of stuff that I can analyze and say, yeah, that's definitely why I enjoyed it. It was just well made, decent, and definitely worth my time. Sound a Drop Fall into Poison is a visual novel for those who enjoy visual novels. It doesn't wow or fall below standards. It is weirdly one of the best examples of a base standard of what an enjoyable VN is. It does what VNs are supposed to do very competently, with a flair of its own identity to make it not be just boring. It has a good story and solid visuals. For those horror aspects it takes, the storytelling is driven by it, and it holds out effectively as well. In general, Sound a Drop has its ups and downs, and usually those amount to its lack of attempt to go above and beyond, but it really is certainly a recommended experience. If you like visual novels, you'll probably enjoy this. If you don't, then this one certainly won't change your mind. Well, unless you really like fetishized gore and horror. And there really isn't much of that in the first place. It's not very prominent, it's just every once in a while. So yeah, maybe you wouldn't enjoy it for that either. Okay, recommendations. I have not actually read a ton of visual novels that take this whole bad end route, the more horror-esque part to it. The most obvious one, probably one of the more prominent ones, at least in Western popularity, is the Zero Escape series. It has its bad ends, it has its good ends, it has its mind-warping mysteries, and it definitely does it a lot better than Sound of Drop, though it doesn't have the horror is much more psychological than it is danger-related. I mean, I have to say Zero Escape is much better than this, but Sound of Drop's still enjoyable. But if you like Sound of Drop, there's a decent chance you like Zero Escape, because I think Zero Escape is probably like the standard of how you do it really well, while Sound of Drop is how you do it like, yeah, that was good. Another one from the same writer, interestingly enough. Apparently, I don't read enough of these, and all the ones of this sort that I like are from the same writer. Remember 11. It has its issues. It's not completely done, so you might be disappointed by the ending, but it's really well written. It has good characters. It has bad ends. It has that story route structure of making choices to get bad ends or avoid those down a path to getting a good end. In Remember 11's case, it's not deviating much, but it's more about moving to that point. Other than that, I don't have much else to say. I'm sorry, this came up way later than it really needed to. I have to admit, I had a bit of writer's block when I was trying to write this. Combination of being busy, which is a bad excuse, and that writer's block, and a lot of stuff happening at the same time. I'm sorry, I wanted to get this out quicker. I don't know how long this is going to be. I don't know any of this. I actually am recording this very soon after finishing writing it, which is not that common. Sorry, I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you next time for another review. Sound of Drop is good. Zero Escape is good. Remember 11's good. All that stuff good. Visual novels, great stuff.